vast steppe was silent, unified under the white banner of the 9 yak-tails, fluttering in the cold wind. But peace was a restless thing for a Mongol. Genghis Khan sat on his throne of felt, gazing south with eyes like flint. The reorganization of the tribes was complete. The Yasa law was absolute. But the nomadic economy needed flow, it needed trade, and it needed expansion to survive. The wolf had eaten all the sheep of the steppe. Now it looked critically towards the dragons beyond the wall. The Jin dynasty in the south and the western Xia to the southwest were ancient, wealthy, and arrogant. They saw the Mongols as savages, mere beasts to be managed. Genghis saw them as the next horizon. The winds shifted, carrying the scent of iron and gold. The time of the raid was over. The time of conquest had begun. The endless blue sky seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the thunder of hooves. The first test was the western Xia. They were the gateway to the Silk Road, a kingdom of oasis cities and desert fortresses. Genghis did not rush. He moved his army like a slow tide, methodical and terrifying. He was testing his new war machine, refining the decimal system in the crucible of foreign soil. The Xia fought bravely, hiding behind their thick walls. But they had never seen siege warfare like this. The Mongols diverted rivers to flood cities. They built catapults from the forests. It was a brutal education. The Xia emperor, isolated and desperate, finally bowed his head. He offered tribute, camels, silver, and soldiers. It was the first crack in the dam, the first submission of a sedentary power to the lords of the open grass. The Mongols learned that stone walls could fall, and that the world was soft and ripe for the taking. Emboldened, Genghis turned his eyes to the true prize, the Golden Khan of the Jin dynasty, a power that had humiliated the Mongols for centuries. When the new Jin emperor demanded Genghis bow to receive an edict, Genghis turned his horse south and spat on the ground in a gesture of utter contempt. It was a supreme insult, a declaration of war that echoed from the Gobi to the Yellow Sea. I thought the emperor of the north was a god, Genghis sneered. But if he is just a man like this, why should I bow? The insult was calculated. Genghis knew the Jin were distracted by wars in the south. He gathered his generals on the Onion River. The order was simple, chilling, and absolute. The Golden Khan is weak. We will take his gold and his pride. The army roared in approval, raising their sabers to the sun. To reach the heart of the Jin, the army had to cross the Gobi Desert. It was a logistic nightmare that would have killed a lesser force. But the Mongols were not an army of supply lines. They were an army of nature. They traveled light, drinking mare's milk and blood drawn from their horses' veins. They moved across the dried bones of the desert like a phantom wind, ignoring the heat. Genghis led them, his will driving them forward when the thirst became unbearable. They emerged from the dust clouds on the edge of the Chinese heartland, not as exhausted survivors, but as hungry predators. The Jin border guards watched in horror as the horizon turned dark with cavalry. The Gobi had not stopped them, it had only sharpened their appetite and hardened their resolve. The dust of the crossing still clung to their furs, a badge of their endurance. The decisive clash came at Yehuling, the ridge of the wild foxes. The Jin had assembled a massive host, hundreds of thousands strong, confident in their numbers and their heavy cavalry. They blocked the mountain passes, a wall of steel. Genghis did not flinch. He sent squads to climb the treacherous peaks flanking the enemy positions. The battle was a meat grinder. The Mongols, lighter and faster, swarmed around the heavy Jin formations like wasps stinging a bull. Communications broke down. The Jin army, crowded in the narrow valley, began to trample its own men. It was not a battle, it was a slaughter. The flower of the Jin military lay dead in the mountain passes, their armor rusting in the sun. The road to the capital was open, and the silence of the dead was deafening. The foxes would feast well this season. With the main Jin army shattered, the Mongol forces spread out across the North China plain like a tsunami. It was a campaign of terror and mobility. They did not occupy land, they stripped it. They burned villages to drive refugees into the fortified cities, consuming the enemy's food supplies. It was ruthless, mathematical warfare. City after city fell or opened its gates in fear. The smoke of burning harvests darkened the sun for weeks. Genghis Khan was dismantling the infrastructure of a centuries-old empire with the efficiency of a butcher dressing a carcass. The Jin court in Chengdu trembled, watching the reports of devastated provinces pile up like snowdrifts. The barbarians were not going away. They were seemingly ending the civilized world. Everywhere they went, they left only ash and the memory of fear. Genghis stood before the walls of Chengdu, modern-day Beijing. They were a marvel of engineering, 40 feet high, stretching for miles, studded with watchtowers and protected by moats. Inside sat the Golden Khan, surrounded by millions of starving citizens. Most nomad armies would have looked at such fortifications and turned back to the steppe. Genghis set up camp. He did not need to climb the walls. He only needed to wait. He built a counter wall around the city, sealing it off from the world. It was a contest of wills. The Mongols sat in their yurts, feasting on the surrounding countryside, while inside the golden palaces, the price of a rat rose to the price of gold. The silence of the siege was louder than any battle cry. History was waiting for the gates to open, and the spectre of starvation walked the streets within. The siege dragged on for months. Winter came, turning the plain into a sheet of ice. But the Mongols were creatures of the cold. Inside Chengdu, the situation descended into madness. Silk was burned for warmth. The granaries were swept clean. Desperation turned men into beasts. The Jin generals argued and plotted, paralysis gripping the court. Genghis watched from his tent, patient as a vulture. He sent messengers offering terms, only to withdraw them, playing with the emperor's hope. He was teaching the world a lesson. Stone walls could not protect you from the sky. The city was a prison, and he held the only key. The cold wind howled through the camp, carrying the smell of wood smoke and victory, freezing the marrow of the defenders who peered fearfully from the battlements. Reports escaped the city of unspeakable horrors. The starving population had turned to cannibalism. Markets sold human flesh openly. The social order, built on thousands of years of Confucian tradition, collapsed under the weight of hunger. The emperor finally broke. He sent an envoy to Genghis, offering a princess, thousands of horses, and wagon loads of gold and silk. He agreed to a humiliating peace. Genghis accepted the tribute. He ordered his army to pack up. It seemed the siege was over. But as the Mongols withdrew, the foolish emperor decided to move his capital south to Kaifeng, fleeing the danger. Genghis saw this as a breach of trust, a sign of continued resistance. He turned his horse around, his eyes cold with betrayal. The truce was over, and mercy had evaporated like mist. The return was swift and merciless. This time, there would be no negotiations. The Mongols stormed the weakened, demoralized city. The sack of Chengdu was apocalyptic. For a month, the city burned. The fires were so bright they illuminated the night sky for miles. The accumulated wealth of generations, libraries, art, temples, vanished in smoke. The looting was systematic. Warriors filled their saddlebags with emeralds and pearls, discarding silver as too heavy. The streets ran with blood. The canals were choked with bodies. It was the death of a capital, a warning carved into the earth that no power was safe from the wrath of the Khan. The smoke rose like a dark pillar, marking the end of an era. The Golden City was now a city of ash and ghosts. Amidst the ashes, Genghis found treasures more valuable than gold. He captured Jin engineers, scholars, and bureaucrats. He found men like Yaluchukai, a tall, bearded Khitan scholar, who told him, "The empire can be conquered from horseback, but it cannot be ruled from horseback." Genghis listened. He incorporated these captured minds into his machine. He took the siege engineers, who knew how to build catapults and firebombs. He took the scribes who knew how to tax and administer. He was not just destroying a civilization, he was absorbing it. The Mongol army was evolving, acquiring the technology to knock down any wall on earth. They were becoming a storm that could break stone. The steppe warriors were learning the dark arts of civilization to perfect their war. Leaving the ruin of the Jin dynasty behind, Genghis turned his gaze west. He was rich beyond his wildest dreams. His men were clad in silk, their weapons inlaid with silver. But the West called to him. The Silk Road stretched out towards the setting sun, towards lands of Muslims and Christians, towards the unknown. He left a general, Mughali, to finish the slow grinding war against the Jin remnants in the south. Genghis took his main host back to the high steppe to rest and refit. He did not know it yet, but the war in China had just been the prelude. The true storm was about to break over the Islamic world, a storm of iron and fire that would change history forever. The world was about to become much smaller. Genghis sought trade, not war, with the West. He sent a massive caravan to the Khwarezmian Empire, a superpower that stretched from Persia to Central Asia. The caravan was laden with gold, silver, innocent merchandise, and a message of friendship to Sultan Muhammad II. I am the master of the lands of the rising sun. You are the master of the lands of the setting sun. Let there be a firm treaty of friendship and peace between us. It was a genuine offer. The Mongols valued trade above almost anything else. The caravan arrived at the border city of Otrar, comprised of Muslim merchants under Mongol protection, expecting hospitality. They brought gifts of peace. Unaware, they were walking into a trap set by arrogance and greed. Fate hung by a thread. But the governor of Otrar, Inalchuk, was greedy and suspicious. He accused the merchants of being spies, a convenient lie to seize their immense wealth. With the permission of the Sultan, he executed the entire caravan. 450 men were slaughtered, their goods confiscated. Only one camel driver escaped to tell the tale. When Genghis heard the news, he did not rage immediately. He went to a mountain, covered his head, and wept. He had offered an open hand, and they had cut it off. He decided to give the Sultan one last chance to make it right, sending 3 envoys to demand the governor be handed over. The steppe held its breath, waiting for the Sultan's answer, knowing the consequences would be catastrophic. Sultan Muhammad made the fatal mistake of his life. He looked at the Mongol envoys, rough men in furs, and despised them. He believed his empire, with its millions of subjects and professional armies, was invincible. He ordered the head of the chief Muslim envoy cut off. The 2 Mongol envoys had their beards shaved, a grave insult, and were sent back carrying the head of their companion. When they arrived back at Genghis's camp, the silence was terrifying. Genghis climbed to the summit of the Burkhan Khaldun. He prayed to the eternal blue sky for 3 days and nights. He descended with a face like stone. I am not the author of this trouble, he said. Grant me vengeance. The war had begun, and it would be total and unforgiving. The mobilization was total. Genghis left the war in China on hold. He summoned every able bodied man, every ally, every vassal. He marched west with an army of 200,000 men, a force of nature moving across the Altai Mountains. They brought with them the Chinese siege engineers, the doctors, the scribes. It was a moving nation dedicated to destruction. The Sultan heard reports of the approaching storm but dismissed them. He spread his vast army out in garrisons along the river, believing the Mongols would tire themselves out against his fortresses. He did not understand who was coming. He did not know he was facing the greatest military mind in history. The ground shook under the hooves of the Mongol horses, a drumbeat of approaching doom that would not stop. The invasion began not as a single thrust, but as a coordinated, multi-pronged assault that baffled the Khwarezmian generals. Joji rode from the north. Chagatai and Ogedai besieged the border forts, and Genghis himself disappeared into the Kizil Kum desert. The speed was impossible. Mongol columns appeared out of nowhere, striking deep behind enemy lines, cutting communications. The Sultan's strategy of static defense collapsed instantly. He was paralyzed, unable to move his massive army to meet a threat that seemed to be everywhere at once. The Mongols were not just fighting an army, they were fighting the mind of the Sultan, dismantling his sanity piece by piece. Panic spread like a plague through the empire, turning disciplined soldiers into frightened children in the face of the unknown. The city of Otrar, where the crime had been committed, was the first to feel the full weight of the Khan's fury. The siege lasted 5 months. The governor Inalchuk fought desperately, knowing his fate. When the walls were finally breached and the citadel stormed, the Mongols fought their way to the governor. He was captured alive. Genghis did not grant him a quick death. In a final act of poetic justice, molten silver was poured into Inalchuk's eyes and ears. You liked silver so much, the legend says. Now have your fill. The city was leveled, its population enslaved or killed. The debt of the caravan was paid in full. The lesson was written in blood for all to see. A warning to anyone who would harm a Mongol envoy. While his sons besieged Otrar, Genghis pulled off his masterpiece. He led a column across the impassable Kizilkum desert, a feat considered impossible by the locals. They arrived at the gates of Bukhara, deep in the empire's rear, completely undetected. The citizens of Bukhara looked over their walls to see the steppe warriors surrounding them like a sudden sea. They were shocked. The garrison charged out and was annihilated on the banks of the Amudarya. The city elders, realizing resistance was futile, opened the gates. Genghis rode into the ancient city of scholars and mosques, the hooves of his horse ringing on the cobblestones. He had bypassed the entire defense line. It was a strategic checkmate that would be studied for centuries. He gathered the rich and the powerful of Bukhara in the great Friday Mosque. He ascended the pulpit where the Imam usually stood. He looked down at the trembling elite of the city. "O people, know that you have committed great sins," he announced, his voice echoing in the cavernous hall. "If you had not committed great sins, God would not have sent a punishment like me upon you." It was a moment of supreme psychological dominance. He declared himself the flail of God. He ordered the city's grain to be fed to his horses and the scripture chests to be used as troughs. He stripped the city of its dignity before he stripped it of its life, breaking their spirit completely. The silence in the mosque was the silence of judgment and finality. Bukhara was burned. The fire raged for days, turning the pearl of Islam into a blackened ruin. The walls were pulled down, the moats filled. It was a message to the rest of the empire. Resistance means extinction. The refugees streamed toward Samarkand, spreading tales of the demons who rode out of the desert. Terror was Genghis's most potent weapon. He wanted the enemy to be so paralyzed by fear that they defeated themselves. And it worked. The morale of the Khwarezmian army disintegrated. Soldiers deserted. Governors fled. The structure of the state was dissolving before the Mongols even drew their swords via the sheer weight of fear. A great darkness had descended on the land, and there was no light to be found. Next was Samarkand, the capital, defended by 110,000 men and 20 war elephants. The Sultan had boasted it could hold out for years. Genghis arrived and surrounded it. He used the prisoners from Bukhara as human shields, forcing them to push the siege engines forward. The defenders were horrified, the garrison demoralized, and seeing the fate of their neighbors, surrendered after only 5 days. They hoped for mercy. Genghis ordered the elephants killed and the 30,000 soldiers of the garrison assembled on the plain. He did not trust men who had betrayed their own sultan. He ordered them all executed. The great city was looted, its artisans sent to Mongolia, its population scattered to the winds. The jewel of the empire was crushed into the dust. The slaughter that followed in the city of Urgench and across the region was unprecedented. The numbers recorded by historians are staggering. Millions dead. Even allowing for exaggeration, the destruction was absolute. The irrigation systems that sustained life in the desert were destroyed, turning fertile land back into dust. The Gangli Turks, the Sultan's elite support base, were systematically exterminated. Genghis was removing a competitor civilization from the map. He was ensuring that no threat would ever rise from the west again. The rivers ran red with blood, literally changing the ecology of the region for centuries. It was the wrath of a god made manifest in iron and ash. The birds of prey feasted for years, and the wolves grew fat. Sultan Muhammad II, the man who had dismissed the Mongols as savages, died a fugitive, hunted by Jebe and Subutai like a wild animal. He fled west, abandoning his armies, his family, and his dignity. He slept in his clothes, moving every night, terrified of the thunder of hooves on the horizon. he finally took refuge on a small, leper-infested island in the Caspian Sea. There, alone, dressed in rags, the ruler of an empire died of pleurisy and despair. He was buried in the shirt of a servant. The man who had challenged Genghis Khan had lost everything, leaving his empire to be devoured by the wolves he had provoked. It was a lonely, pathetic end for a king who once ruled half the world, now owning nothing but a shallow grave. With the Khwarezmian Empire decapitated, Genghis allowed his greatest dogs of war, Subutai and Jebe, to go on a reconnaissance mission west. It became the greatest cavalry raid in history. With 20,000 men, they circled the Caspian Sea, riding into the unknown lands of the Caucasus and Russia. They faced the kingdom of Georgia, confident in the heavy knights. Subutai feigned retreat, luring the slow Georgian knights into an ambush where Mongol archers slaughtered them. They crushed a kingdom in a passing afternoon. They crossed the Caucasus Mountains in winter, a feat of endurance that terrified the local tribes. They were ghosts, appearing, killing, and vanishing into the mist, leaving only burning villages and legends in their wake. They rode onto the southern Russian steppes, encountering the Cumans and the Rus' princes. The Russian princes gathered a mighty coalition to stop this unknown threat from the east. 80,000 Russian and Cuman warriors marched against Subutai's 20,000. The Mongols played their favorite game, the feigned retreat. For 9 days, they rode away, drawing the arrogant Russian army out, stretching their lines, exhausting their horses. The Russians thought the barbarians were fleeing in terror. They did not know they were being led into a killing box. On the banks of the Kalka River, Subutai stopped and turned his horses around. The trap was sprung, and the jaws of the wolf snapped shut, dooming the princes. The Battle of Kalka River was a masterclass in annihilation. The Mongol heavy cavalry charged into the disorganized Russian vanguard. The Rus' panic spread instantly. The Mongols encircled them, their arrows darkening the sky. It was not a battle, it was a harvest. The Russian princes, who had dismissed the Mongols as men of hell, died by the thousands. The river was choked with bodies. The flower of the Kievan Rus nobility was wiped out in a single day. Subutai had defeated an army 4 times his size, thousands of miles from home, with no reinforcements. It remains one of the greatest military feats in history. The West had tasted the Mongol blade for the first time, and it was a taste of death. After the victory, the Mongols captured the surviving princes. They did not execute them with swords. In a display of macabre dominance, they laid the princes on the ground and built a heavy wooden platform over them. The Mongol generals sat on the platform and held a victory banquet. As they drank and feasted into the night, the princes beneath were slowly crushed and suffocated to death. Their groans mingled with the songs of the victors. It was a message to the West. We are the new lords of the earth, and you are merely the floorboards beneath our feet. The brutality was the message, and it would be remembered for 1,000 years in the songs of the Rus. The Great Raid ended. Subutai and Jebe circled back east to rejoin Genghis Khan, completing a 5,000-mile circuit of destruction. They had gathered intelligence on Europe, Russia, and the Middle East that would pave the way for future invasions. They had proven that no army stood a chance against the Mongol Tumans. However, Jebe, the legendary archer who had once shot Genghis's horse, died of fever on the return journey. He was buried on the steppe he had helped conquer. Genghis welcomed Subutai back, listening to the stories of the lands of the setting sun. The map of the world had grown larger, and it all belonged to the Mongols. The horizon now stretched to the Atlantic, beckoning them forward. Genghis Khan stood on the banks of the Irtysh River, looking at his returning armies. He was old now. His face was a map of the campaigns he had fought. He had united the tribes, conquered the Jin, destroyed the Khwarezmians, and struck fear into the heart of Europe. The world was on fire, and he held the torch. He knew his time was ending, but his legacy was secure. He had built a bridge between East and West, paved with bones and gold. The wolf of the steppe had become the master of the world, and as the sun set over the vast empire, he knew that his sons would ride even further. The storm would never end. It would only grow stronger, consuming everything in its path.